we'll just steal those 2 minutes at the end. Thanks everyone for being here and accepting the invitation for this session, which is very exciting because you have a very cool paper. So we'll have 20 minutes for each of you. So I'd suggest like 15 minutes for presentation. I can let you know once you have like 2 minutes left. And then we leave 5 minutes for questions. And as you present, maybe just like one clarifying question, I guess would be okay. 1 or 2 clarifying questions. And just for you to know, the third and fourth presentations, we're going to switch times. So Raul will present at the end, and Mika will present third. So go ahead, Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Santiago, for putting this together. Okay. So I'm very happy to present this new work. This is joint work with Victoria Barone, who is a PhD student at UCLA, and she will be on the market next year. And she's a fantastic economist. So this is about the opioid epidemic, causes and consequences. So overdose deaths involving opioids have increased dramatically in the US in the past 20 years. They've reached over 250,000 since 1999. And unfortunately, this doesn't end here, but people have also documented that the epidemic has had consequences on claims from disability, worsening of birth outcomes, and a record number of children living in foster care as a result of their parents' drug abuse. However, it is very hard to know what are the causes of the epidemic and also the effects, because deteriorating socioeconomic conditions could have caused the increased demand for pain medication, but also subsequent negative outcomes. However, we cannot shut our eyes to the fact that there were huge supply disruptors. So there was a dramatic increase in opioid access. There were changes in physicians' prescription attitudes, and there was a very aggressive marketing from pharmaceuticals trying to push these prescription opioids. So what this means is that the variation in the level of prescription opioids across space and over time is not going to be random, but it's going to be a function of things like the incidence of pain in the population, which could be a source of negative selection, but also access to healthcare and the number of physicians per capita, which could be a source of positive selection. So this is why it is hard to answer these questions. So what we're going to do in this paper is going to propose a novel identification strategy where we exploit Purdue Pharma's initial marketing plans. So we studied recently unsealed court records from state litigation against Purdue Pharma, specifically those of Kentucky and Oklahoma against Purdue Pharma. And by doing that, we learned that because of marketing and regulatory restrictions, Purdue Pharma initially targeted the cancer market. So we're going to use this to first link Purdue Pharma's marketing plans to the future supply, the origin of the increase in supply. And then we're going to use this as an instrument to look at the causal effect of the opioid epidemic on a host of other important variables, such as drug-related mortality, demand for social assistance, and birth and fertility outcomes. So what do we find? Well, first, we find that Purdue's initial marketing had very large effects on the distribution of prescription opioids in the future. So places that have the highest level of cancer incidence at the time of launch of OxyContin receive a disproportionate amount of prescription opioids in the future. And then we can use this to look at what happened down the road along other variables. So we see that there were very large increases in death from prescription opioids overdoses, so an increase of 90% in those places, but also an increase of 40% on deaths from any opioids, and this is going to be around 200,000 deaths. However, we don't find evidence of increases in mortality from other deaths of despair, so things like suicide or things like liver disease or alcohol-related diseases. We find that there are very large effects on increases for SNAP, which is food stamps, or disability, both SSI and SSDI. And we find a worsening of birth outcomes, so decreases in pregnancy duration, decreases in birth weight, and health at birth. And we also find positive effects in fertility. Okay, so we contribute to two branches of the literature, one related to the origins of the opioid epidemic, and here we are providing new evidence that links OxyContent's initial marketing to the rise in supply of opioids, and we're also contributing to the literature on the effects of the opioid epidemic, where there is previous work on drug mortality, disability, and maternal outcomes, but most of this is looking at different policies that try to stop the opioid epidemic, whereas here we're looking at direct evidence of the epidemic, and also we're the first to have like a comprehensive view of the epidemic. So now let me tell you a bit more about the context and Purdue's marketing strategy, and then we'll talk about the data and results in more detail. So why are opioids different or scary or dangerous? The problem with opioids is that they're very highly addictive, and then this addiction or this dependence can happen at prescribed doses. So you don't need to be abusing your medication in order to develop dependency and withdrawal. And these added to the fact that at the peak of the epidemic, so in 2012, there were 80 prescriptions per 100 persons in the US. So there was just widespread levels of prescription of opioids. And even in 2017, 35% of adults reported to be using opioids. So there is just an excessive amount of prescription and of use of these very, very dangerous drugs. One thing that is important to note is that the rise in consumption of prescription opioids is really the rise in consumption of oxycodone. So here we see in orange that's the active ingredient of OxyContin, and that's really what drove the very large increase in prescription opioids in the US. Now, let me tell you more about OxyContin. So this is the blockbuster drug produced by Purdue Pharma, which was introduced in the market in '96, and whose active ingredient is oxycodone. So the yellow area that was really driving the increase in prescription opioids. And why was this such a blockbuster drug? One part of it is going to be about the sales strategy and how many people they were just employing to push this drug. But there's another component which makes it very dangerous, which is that there were technological innovations in the production of this drug. So things like the fact that it's a single agent drug and the fact that they develop an extended release formulation. I could talk about this much longer, but the point here is that both of these things are going to mean that the amount of opioid that is going to be in each tablet or in each pill is going to dramatically increase. So before the introduction of OxyContin, the most commonly prescribed form of oxycodone was Percocet, and in each pill you would have 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone. Because of this technological innovation, the most commonly prescribed OxyContin pill is going to have between 20 or 40 milligrams of oxycodone per tablet, and sometimes they will also be prescribing tablets with 80 and 160 milligrams of oxycodone. So this just dramatically changes your access to very potent opioids. So what's the content in which this drug is introduced in the market? So pre-OxyContin launch, to some extent, there is a lot of stigma around the use of opioids, and it's only used in the context of cancer pain and end-of-life pain. And in this context, Purdue Pharma is the manufacturing of MS-Contin, which is the gold standard to treat cancer pain. However, they're about to face generic competition. So in response to this generic competition, they're going to develop OxyContin with the idea that this new drug is going to take over the cancer pain market that was MS-Contins before, but always with the idea to grow from there. They always wanted to grow into the larger non-cancer pain market. But they faced two main challenges in doing this. First, the stigma of the use of opioids in that larger market, and also the extra paperwork around using Schedule II drugs for these conditions. So how they're going to address this? Well, part of it is going to be about the message or the language around opioids. So they're going to push this idea about how in America there is an untreated pain epidemic. So millions of workers in the US are going every day to work with unbearable amount of pain and nobody's doing anything about it. They're going to push this idea of how pain is the fifth vital sign. So pain should be treated in and of itself and not as a sign of something else. They're going to just lie about the addiction rate of opioids. And all of these just to change the personality of opioids and the personality of oxycodone. And they're going to target the cancer market because they know that that's a market that doesn't have that stigma. That's a market that is already used to prescribing and using opioids. Same with physicians and pharmacies. But in the second phase, they're going to expand to the larger non-cancer brain market, but they're going to focus disproportionately on top prescribers. And this is going to be important for us because this creates a path dependency in which everywhere where you started, you're also going to focus in the future because that's where you're already prescribing the most. So these are different quotes from the court records, but this one specifically really summarizes the strategy. So here is Purdue Pharma saying that the use of OxyContin in cancer patients initiated by their oncologist and then referred back to their family practitioners will result in a comfort that will enable the expansion of using chronic non-malignant pain patients also seen by the family practice specialists. So the idea is always we're going to start in the cancer market, but with the plan to expand from there. So this is basically going to be our identification strategy. So exploit the fact that areas with higher cancer incidence receive disproportionate amount of marketing. And then the later strategy to focus on high prescribers is going to make this last even in the future. So this will allow us to link, to assess the role of supply in the crisis, and also to estimate the causal effect of the epidemic on a broad range of outcomes. Okay. So our data, our prescription opioids data comes from the DEA, which tracks the distribution of all controlled substances. Our mortality data is going to come from the National Vital Statistics System, and our SNAP and SSDI data is going to come from federal reports. Our final data set is going to be of almost 12,000 observations, which are going to come at the commuting zone year level, and our data is from 1999 until 2018. Okay, so two things I need to talk about in this strategy. First, I'm going to show you the relevance of this instrument, and then we're going to talk about the exogeneity and exclusion restriction. So in terms of relevance, so what I'm showing you here is, well, what happens if we split commuting zones by their cancer incidence at the time of OxyContin's launch? So in the solid line, we have commuting zones that have the highest quartile of cancer incidence. And in the dashed line, we have the commuting zone with the bottom quartile of cancer incidence. And what we see here is that they both started in very similar levels of prescription opioids per capita. However, there is an explosion of an influx of prescription opioids in those places where there is higher cancer incidence. And it's not that cancer is growing in these places. Actually, the growth rates are very similar. So if we were to look at that in regression form, so what we're doing here, so this is our first stage, is going to be how much of cancer mortality in 94, 96, which is the time of launch, how much that predicts future prescription opioids per capita. And here we're just adding controls and fixed effect. And what we see is that there is a very strong and stable relationship between cancer in 94 and 96 and future shipments of prescription opioids per capita. So that's about the first stage. Now, in terms of the exogeneity and exclusion restriction, we can do a couple of things. So, of course, the cancer incidence is not something that is exogenous. So how are we going to sell the fact that this is still okay is, well, we can always look at the pre-period. So what happens if we just shift everything back and say the furthest back that we can go is 89, 90? So what about does cancer incidence at that time will say that places with higher or lower cancer incidence are on different growth or different paths. Here, what we see in terms of socioeconomic variables, or also in terms of our main variables, we don't see that places that have higher or lower cancer incidence in the pre-period are going to be on a different trajectory. We can also look at this more directly with our, yes. with our main data. So here we're looking at what's the effect of our instrument. So cancer mortality 94-96 as a function, how much of that predicts prescription opioid mortality or all opioid mortality before the launch of OxyContin and after the launch of OxyContin. So before we really see that there is no relationship either here or here, but after there is a huge divergence in terms of how predictive cancer mortality is over here. So this is now we can move on to our main specification, which is just going to be an instrumental variables where we instrument for prescription opioids with our measure of cancer mortality in the pre-period. And I'll just show you this very fast. So we find here again very strong effects on prescription opioids mortality and also all types of opioids mortality. But however, we don't find other effects in terms of mortality for other outcomes like deaths of despair, very positive effects, or I mean, negative in the sense of societal or like general equilibrium wise. So increases in disability, increases in share of population enrolled in SNAP, in general worsening of birth outcomes, increases also worsening of maternal outcomes. However, we do find an increase in fertility rate driven mostly by young women, but won't go over that. So I'll just conclude in my last minute. So we document the devastating and far-reaching consequences of the aggressive and deceitful marketing of pharmaceutical companies when pushing prescription opioids. And we think that this has direct policy implication regarding the desirability of these promotional efforts pursued by pharmaceutical companies. And things like monitoring, limiting, disclosing these promotional efforts is one thing that results from this paper. Also providing age and diagnosis specific drug risk profiles. So it's very different to prescribe opioids for a 90-year-old person who broke their hip relative to a 20-year-old person who has a tooth pain. So these should be part of the regulatory system around prescription opioids, and it's not the case. And of course, also drug abuse reporting system. When you study the opioid epidemic, it's really frustrating to see how many of these things could have been stopped before, and they weren't because the data wasn't there to stop these things. So thank you so much. I think I ran a race.
Thank you, Carolina. Yeah, this is like Lacea style, I guess. I don't know if anyone has any questions. We have like 3-4 minutes for questions. I have one, but I saw Mika.
Yes. No,
yeah.
I just have one question, Carolina, and probably I got lost because it was so fast, everything. So do you show any evidence on this first stage about how it increased aggressive marketing? And also I think it would be good if you can add something about the magnitudes about this, because they're having like so many different like hypotheses to explain this of the race of opioid epidemic, and then you're showing something different. So I think that would allow us to know how much is this explaining that race compared to the other things that in the literature they have shown.
So I don't know if your first question is related to if we can, so we're linking what our rating from their marketing plans
Yes.
and mapping that to the level of prescription opioids, but in that like very early stage period, we don't have data on promotional efforts. So there is some of that data that starts in 2014, but it's way too late for what we're trying to document. We're trying we're still digging into these court files to see if like maybe for a couple of states we can get some call logs or something that can get at that like kind of like intermediate step. But as of now, we don't have that. And in terms of, we definitely could have more on like what are the competing, the contributing factors and how much of this is explained by like this mechanism. We don't have that in the paper, but we can do definitely more. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you. Raul, do you have?
Yeah, it's not going to be a very useful comment. It's not. It's more like a out of curiosity. The whole capitalist system is based on the premise that we have massive incentives to deceive other people through marketing. And so my question to you is, that doesn't seem to be a paper just about health, and I don't know the literature. There was some theoretical literature about how the incentives for competition lead to kind of inefficient investment in marketing, but especially when marketing can manipulate preferences or deceive. I think this is a super interesting and important area of research, but I haven't seen anything. So perhaps, I don't know if it's about the framing of your paper that it actually speaks too much.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great point. And why did this happen in the US and not in other places? I think it's because the role of promotional efforts in the US is just so much bigger than in other places. But there's been also people that worry about all of these pharmaceutical companies pushing drugs to physicians, more about the increase of prescription drugs in general, and they want to limit pharmaceutical promotion because of that, not linked to the risk of opiates. But yeah, this is an added reason of why you really need to monitor these things and limit how much pharmaceuticals have access to physicians' time. I mean, they're just inviting them to trips, or buying them dinners, showing up in their offices, calling them all the time. So yes, definitely. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. All right, so let me just say hello to Juan, who's the chair of Al Capone, in addition to being the chairman of the conference. So co-organizer of the session with me. Graf, your turn. I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Carolina. Great paper.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Santiago, for putting the session together, and for Juan, Santiago and Juan both for putting the session together. So this is joint work with Carlos, Anant, Danielle, Jorge, and Audrey. Danielle and Audrey will actually be on the job market in about a year or two, maybe. So keep an eye out for them. And some of you may know that we've been working on why youth in Medellin get involved with crime. But this paper really is about transportation in some ways, which is, under this understanding that transportation infrastructure expansion can actually improve access to jobs in other parts of the city. And then if you can get access to good jobs elsewhere, you may be less likely to get involved with your local street gang, right? And so you may get a reduction in crime if there's better transportation and you can access other good jobs elsewhere. But what you really see in cities around the world, including most of the cities that I ever lived in, is that cities block these projects that try to expand transit infrastructure because they're worried that essentially what will happen is that when you connect their neighborhood to more transit, there'll be kind of more crime in their neighborhood. So there'll be an export of crime to these kind of affluent neighborhoods, right? So this paper is essentially just trying to answer this question, right? Does improving this connectedness between these segregated and unequal parts of the city import opportunity to low-income neighborhoods or export crime to kind of more high-income neighborhoods? But to kind of answer this question, it's kind of difficult because there are a bunch of research design challenges. When you expand transportation, there's really no control group. Every part of the city is either directly or indirectly treated. As people move from part A to part B, both A and B are treated. You'll have other kinds of geographical spillovers. You'll have cross-sectoral externalities. So we're gonna have to kind of rely a little bit more on modeling a little bit about what's going on when you include these kinds of transit expansions. But to be able to do this well, you need really, really good data, right? So you need data on where people live, where they work, and where they commit crimes. So what we do is, we put together this administrative data exactly on this, like where people live, where they work, and where they commit crime. And we're going to match this data using everyone's ID, essentially their social security number, so we kind of can follow people based on where they're living, working, and committing crimes. You also need really good variation in crime and transportation costs. So, we're doing this in the context of Medellin, where there's a lot of variation in gang neighborhoods and non-gang neighborhoods. And we're going to do this over a period where there was this kind of rollout of their cable car system over time that allows us to have good variation in changes in transportation costs. So, many of you might be familiar with some of these spatial GE models, where there's actually a modeling innovation that we have here as well, which is we're going to model externalities across sectors. So to kind of explain the intuition behind what we mean by that is, you could be in a neighborhood where there's, say, a lot of youth engaged in crime, but if they're committing a lot of crimes in that neighborhood and, they're extorting the businesses or burglaring the businesses, then then businesses can't function properly. So there's less formal sector productivity in those neighborhoods. But if businesses can't function properly, then there's no good jobs in that neighborhood. So there's fewer formal sector jobs in that neighborhood. But because there's fewer formal sector jobs in that neighborhood, there'll be more youth getting involved in crime. So you get this kind of vicious cycle when you have these cross-sectoral externalities. And you get this kind of what Schelling calls tipping point segregation, these crime sinkhole equilibria, right? And what transportation does is essentially breaks this link. It says, well, so what if there are fewer formal sector jobs in my neighborhood? If there's better transportation, I don't need to work in my neighborhood. I can go work in a different neighborhood where there's better jobs, right? So transportation can get you out of this crime sinkhole equilibrium. That's the modeling innovation on the theoretical side. Now we're doing this in Medellin. This is actually a photograph from my phone exactly 2 years ago, because it was Columbus Day when I took this picture. So, exactly 2 years ago. And, I'm taking a picture from a cable car. So, I mean, many of you know the topography of Medellin, but, it's a beautiful city. There's like a valley, but because it has the steep hills on the side, a lot of the transit is essentially these cable cars that go up the hills. So this is a picture I'm taking from one of the cable cars. This is just a map of the city. There was a metro line along the river even before 2003, but over time, they've started building cable cars across the different years. There was a bus rapid transit system that was installed, which was then expanded. Then there was a cable, to the eastern part, which was then also expanded. And right now they're building this other cable right now. So there was this big expansion between 2002 and 2021 that really transformed the city in many different ways, this expansion in transit infrastructure. But where you build a cable is going to affect crime rates in very different ways. So for instance, in 2004, it looks like, what they did was they connected a gang neighborhood to kind of downtown. So what happened was you saw that crimes in that gang neighborhood actually went down in 2004, when you connect gang neighborhoods to good jobs. But in 2008, what you did was you connected a low-income neighborhood to a high gang neighborhood, and it looked like more youth in those low-income neighborhoods started getting involved with gangs. So you get these heterogeneity in effects based on what types of neighborhoods you're connecting with each other. And so in a reduced form, you're going to miss a lot of the heterogeneity if you just look at the average. The other thing that is hard to do in a reduced form is to try and understand where is the kind of the treated neighborhoods and the controlled neighborhoods, right? Because you're going to have spatial spillovers. So for instance, this is a gang neighborhood, right? When a cable car was built, crime went down in that gang neighborhood, but it may look like there was a spillover to say 2 kilometers away, right? So maybe some crime actually moved away from right near the cable stations to be 2 kilometers away. So this is not really a good control group for this neighborhood, right? So when you have spatial spillovers, you need to think carefully about, what is your treated group and what is the control group. Whereas if you were in a non-gang neighborhood, there may have even been some increase in crime in the same place. So you have to think carefully about how to define what's your treated and control group. And like I said, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity based on your baseline crime rates as well. So this is just some dynamics, is that on average, if you look at all the gang neighborhoods, there was a reduction in crime rates, but whereas in the non-gang neighborhoods, on average, there was not much of a reduction that we could see, right? So with the reduced form, there's suggesting that there'd be these ambiguous effects, and there are these issues of, spatial spillovers. You could also have certain other issues, right? You could have issues of neighborhood by time level shocks. So you could have, say, gang wars suddenly breaking out at the exact same time that you build a cable in that neighborhood that you build a cable, in which case it's hard to identify the effect of the cable and differentiate it from the effect of gang wars, right? Or you could have increases in policing that happens at cable stations, for instance, right? So that's like a neighborhood by time level shock that coincides with the cable. So we need to be able to distinguish from those things as well. We're going to build a framework to address all these issues, essentially, right? So you can't do a simple definition. We're going to have to build a framework to address all these issues. I'm going to summarize the model in a bit of a flow chart. So essentially, the idea is that when new cables are built, it reduces transportation times, right? So if you have certain people involved in crime and involved in formal sector activity at baseline, based on their commuting costs, it'll determine where they commit these crimes and where they work, right? What's important here is their sensitivity to commuting costs, right? So how far are you willing to travel to engage in these activities, right? But where you commit a crime will lower formal sector productivity. Like I said, if you're extorting businesses, that's going to then lead to less business productivity. But for that externality, you need a different source of variation. You can't use the rollout of the cables anymore. You need a different source of variation. And we're going to steal from a different paper that we're writing where they were captured some crime logs and that led to more crime, which then affected formal sector productivity. But then where production takes place will affect what the menu of wage options looks like in the formal sector, which then affects what the wages are in the formal sector and in the criminal sector, which then affects sector choice. So do these youth then join gangs, or do they decide to work in legitimate forms of employment, right? Of course, there's also, you can choose which neighborhood you want to live in. And there's a few other things going on in the model. There's a lot of stuff going on in the model. I'm not going to present the model. But to solve the model, essentially, you need to causally estimate about 3 different parameters using 3 different sources of variation. So these are the 3 different sources of variation in the orange. The 3 elasticities, the first elasticity really is how sensitive you are to changes in travel times, right? So when there's a change in transportation time, how sensitive are you? And are you more likely to now go and work in a different neighborhood as the transportation time changes? This is essentially a gravity regression. It spits right out of the model. But the important thing about this regression is that it's at the origin by destination, by sector, by time level, which means you can put in destination by time level fixed effects, origin by time level fixed effects, and so on and so forth. You can put in all these high dimensional fixed effects. What that means is, even if there are gang wars that somehow happen to break out when a cable is built, or if there are, say, more policing at these cable stations that happens at the same time, you're already controlling for those fixed effects. What you're identifying the theta parameters off of is the changes at the pairwise level from between an origin destination pair, as is a change in transportation time, or is there more increase in flows from an origin to a destination pair, right? So it's a much better identified kind of parameter, which is really important for us. We need to really identify this parameter well. So how a change in the travel time changes, conditional on all these fixed effects, determines whether or not individuals living in a certain origin travel to a certain destination to commit a certain type of crime or engage in formal sector activity, right? So these elasticities are going to be really important in our model. The second type of elasticity that's really important is the crime externality parameter, right? Like I said, that when there is more crime in a neighborhood, it might lower formal sector productivity. For this elasticity, you need a shock to crime. So you need a sudden increase in crime levels so that then we can look at what happens to formal sector wages and employment, right? So for this, we actually steal from a different paper. We're writing a different paper on the capture and extradition of big gang lords. So for instance, when Don Berna was extradited in 2008, what you see is this big increase in homicides in Don Berna neighborhoods relative to non-Don Berna neighborhoods, right? And we use this shock to then identify what happens to formal sector productivity, right? And we do it for a bunch of different crime laws, Valencianos, and so as they all get captured in different points of time, how does it affect formal sector activity? So that's the exogenous source of variation there. Now, once we have these parameters, we can do the counterfactuals. For instance, sorry.
2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, once we have these counterfactuals, once we have these estimates, we can do certain counterfactuals. Like we can actually build the cable line that was built in 2017, right? And see what happens to crime rates. What looks like is that there was about a 10% decline in individuals joining gangs, essentially getting in, well, I shouldn't say gangs, just getting involved in crime. So there's 10% decline in individuals getting involved in crime. Because we have a model, we can talk about welfare and net present value and gain. So there's fewer youth getting involved in crime, but conditional on still staying involved in crime, there was an expansion in where you committed crime. So there was, there was kind of an import of opportunity, so fewer youth committed crime, but there was a bit of an export in where crimes took place. So, fewer youth got involved in crime. So as you change transportation times, fewer people join crime. There's a lot of heterogeneity because of the fact that there's heterogeneity in access to different types of job opportunities, but you do commit crimes in other neighborhoods, right? So knowing all this, you can actually, I built just one cable here, but I could actually build cables in different neighborhoods across the city to understand which is the best neighborhood to really try to build, expand transit infrastructure. So here what I do is show you one of the results, which is based on the market access to formal sector jobs, which means, the option value of different types of formal sector jobs. And if I build cables in neighborhoods that have the least access to formal sector jobs, you'll get the largest reduction in crime rates. So if I really want to lower crime, I should build transit infrastructure in neighborhoods that have the least access to formal sector jobs. So, and that also give you kind of the biggest increases in welfare. So this is an exercise where we're building a cable, essentially connecting every single neighborhood in Medellin and seeing which neighborhoods have the biggest reductions in crime rates and biggest increases in welfare. So, I'm out of time, but essentially what we wanted to show in this paper is that really this access to opportunity in different parts of the city depends on segregation and access to jobs in terms of transit infrastructure. So expanding the transit infrastructure can affect sectoral choice. Do I stay involved in a crime, or do I, do legitimate forms of employment? And the biggest gains were if you really target these transit expansions to neighborhoods that have the least access to formal sector jobs. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gaurav. You made it. It's a long paper, so it's a hard work. I don't know if anyone has questions from the audience. Go ahead, Juan.
So Gaurav, thank you. Great paper. Many things moving on at the same time. It's hard to gather everything that is going on, but so this is going to be very specific, and I apologize for the lack of big picture in my question. But it seemed to me, it seems to me that the capture of Don Berna in the particular example that you mentioned, it's not necessarily an exogenous shock to crime, right? For instance, conceptually, it might reflect some other dynamics that are going on regarding policing or regarding what's going on within his cartel that might make the timing of the capture endogenous. And visually, you do see that there's some pre-trend in the crime in the Don Berna neighborhoods in this particular graph that you're putting in there. So I don't know how important this exogeneity of crime is in the big picture, in the sort of general equilibrium of the paper. But if it is very important, then I would be worried a little bit.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of the Don. So Don Berna was actually arrested much before. Then many years later, like the president tried to struck a deal with the US to extradite him. Then that had to be ratified by the Supreme Court. So what is the event here is, why did they want to extradite him? Because he was actually running everything from the prison. So even though he was arrested and in prison in Medellin, he was still running everything. So then the DEA said, look, the US DEA said, look, we need to extradite him. He's still running everything. You guys can't. So the president said, okay, we'll extradite him. But then the Supreme Court had to approve it. When the Supreme Court approves it, then he can no longer run his cartel from prison. And so then the turf war starts. So we're using not changes in policing in terms of it leading up to his capture, but actually when he gets extradited. The pre-trends, I think I mean, I don't see that much of a pre-trend here. Maybe there's a little bit of an increase here. Maybe when the president's proclamation comes in, maybe that's when there's a bit of a start. But I think the turf war really breaks out, like, about a year later after the Supreme Court says, yeah, you can send them to the US. So that's, and I'm giving Dunburn as an example, but then you get similar things if you look at Valenciano, for instance, right? When Valenciano gets arrested, then you get very similar thing where the turf war breaks out as well. But I think it's a great question because it is an important elasticity for us, that spillover.
Thanks, Gaurav. I have one quick question. You're already doing a lot of things, so I'm not sure whether you can do more, but do you think there's a chance to look at, for instance, displacement in the type of crimes that people commit? Because it may be that, for instance, supply chain for some specific illicit kind of markets change. So you can think of, I don't know, stealing cars and selling auto parts would be different if you have access to the cable car or not. It might change how, for instance, once they steal a motorbike, they need to escape to some place. Maybe this also changes the way they can get away kind of with the crime. So I'm not sure whether you can try to examine something along those lines, because there are for instance, the auto parts market here in Medellin of stolen parts is quite known. Everyone knows where is it, and so you could think of, as in probably many cities in Latin America, I see Mika laugh. So you can probably think of that as another, I don't know, relevant area to be caring about.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, actually. And we could, in our data, we can see it. It's a question of, once you start slicing the data thin by the type of crime, do you have, because, we need origin destination pair level data. So you need people living in this neighborhood committing a crime in this neighborhood, which is usually fine if you kind of aggregate all crimes. But then once you start slicing up by exact different types of crime, you get a lot of zeros for each origin destination. But I think it's a great idea. So we should try it, because one thing we have done is look at the commute, how far people travel to commute different types of crimes, which is essentially getting a little bit at what, So for instance, for property crime, a lot of people will travel to downtown. But for violent crime, a lot of it happens in your own street gang, and when you're engaging in turf war. So there is some heterogeneity in the type of crime, and then we can try to classify it by the things you were saying, essentially, to see. So I think it's a great idea. Actually, we should try that.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gaurav. So now we have Mika, as I told everyone at the beginning, but maybe not all.
I thought it was
here.
Yeah, we changed. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Sorry, I completely forgot. I completely forgot. I was going to say no, it's me. No worries. I have it here. Everything. Just one second.
So go ahead, Mika. I'll let you know once you have 2 minutes left.
Yes. Sorry. There we are. It's here. Perfect. So you can all see my screen. Perfect. Yes. So this is a very long paper, but I tried to reduce a bit. Probably we would just see one outcome, which is important, and I can tell you the rest. So this is joint work with Zach Brown, Eduardo Montero, and Carlos Smith Padilla. So let me motivate this with something that here in the audience is kind of obvious, which is the fact that organized crime and associated extortion is a common aspect of life in many countries. Extortion, for instance, the main source of revenue of El Salvador, the country I'm going to focus today. And about 70% of firms say that they pay extortion. So this is a lot, and this is a big issue. And however, we have little evidence about the effect, about how gang structure, where they are competing or they're having the monopoly of a territory, how this affects extortion, and how does this affect consumers. And we believe that understanding also this coordination between gangs or pacts is particularly important, because sometimes government facilitate this cooperation between criminal organizations, like to sign up for a truce, and also enforcement may affect incentives for gangs to collude. So this is kind of an irrelevant question. However, we have little evidence because first, extortion is difficult to measure systematically. It is difficult to observe, it's rarely reported to the police. For instance, we know that a very small share of extortion victims ever go to the police to report these cases. So this means that we have a lack of understanding of the economics of extortion by organized gangs. So in this paper, what we try to do is first try to understand how do gangs determine extortion rates, whether they price discriminate based on local markets. Then the question that I'm going to focus today is how does gang competition matter for extortion? Whether they are signing a pact or they are competing for territory, does this increase extortion or reduce it? And more importantly, what are downstream effects and the incidence of extortion to consumers? So how we're going to do it is we're going to exploit this new data on a leading wholesale distributor in El Salvador, which has the exact location and payment of about 50,000 extortion incidents. Plus, we also have data on their sales and revenue. And importantly, in the case of El Salvador and many places in Central America, is that gangs require trucks to pay extortion in order to deliver to an area. So if you are one of these buses or distribution companies, you face extortion a lot. The second thing that we are going to explore to try to see how this structure of gangs, whether they're competing or not, affect extortion, is that we are going to exploit this 2016 Non-Aggression Pact, which basically reduced competition between gangs, and we are trying to see what happens with extortion after this. So let me give you a bit of more background, and then I will move to the main results. So in El Salvador, we know that most of this violence is due to these two main gangs, which are MS-13 and Barrio 18, and they are present in almost all the municipalities. Of course, they have more control in certain places where they just these deportees arrive from the US, but they have presence in almost all of the municipalities in El Salvador. And much of the violence can be traced back to their main economic activity, which is extortion. Basically, the gangs fight and compete for territory in order to extort firms, and also they use violence to collect extortion themselves. And as I was saying before, transportation and distribution firms are often a target of extortion. Gangs are require basically trucks to pay extortion in order to deliver to an area. So these are payments described as rights to deliver, not that much as rights to pass through. Like, it's not that they are basically stopping in main highways, they actually go and stop these trucks in small streets rather than in these main roads. And importantly, and I emphasize this because when we started this project, we were thinking that the story was sometimes distributed when they were competing, they pay multiple gangs or they could choose who to pay, but actually that's not the case. The distributors in general, they pay one gang to make a delivery. So gangs have exclusive control of the territory and they compete over territory rather than competing to provide extortion or protection, as we commonly think about these issues. And what happens if you don't pay? Actually, if you don't pay, this can be the consequence. This is just one news of this distribution of bread driver, which basically he refused to pay. And the gang hotel said, okay, look what we do. They set up on fire the trucks. And on this, there are multiple incidents of this, of people that suddenly saying don't pay, but the consequences can be super extreme. So it's not that much of an option of not paying. So this was a big issue of violence in El Salvador. So in 2012, the government sat down with the leaders of these gangs, which were the two gangs, which actually were in prison, as Gaurav just said before, from prisons until they coordinate everything that they do on the ground. So the government was like, okay, this is a lot of violence for competing for territory. So they sat down with the main leaders, there was the Catholic Church was involved and everything, and they negotiated with these gangs to reduce violence. And actually this truce was kind of very successful, homicide rates went down. The problem with this is that all this was done under secrecy, but as soon as the public knew, so this was not supported by the public, so the truce broke and then violence went up again. But importantly is that after this truce, it kind of set up the grounds for gangs to keep negotiating and try to set up, some grounds to not compete. And this materialized in 2016 when they went out to the public and they said, we have this agreement now that we are not going to fight and compete for existing territory. And actually, again, we see that gang violence went down. So some speculate, we were not the first one. When you are there in the ground, people talk about this, that this actually cooperation between gangs, okay, yes, was reducing violence between them, but actually it increased extortion because it gave more breathing room to the gangs to do their operations. There is also anecdotal evidence that it is kind of costly for gangs to do two things. So basically to fight with a rival for territory and also to collect extortion. So, and also they have limited resources. It's not super easy like the recruiting process. Also collecting extortion is costly. You need to know more or less which is the demand, like how much people are willing to pay. So there are a lot of things that they have to do. And especially it's costly, as one of these gang members told me, when you are targeted all the time by the rival gangs. So overall, like in surveys, Salvadorians largely believe that the truth benefit the gangs and not the general citizen. So what we're going to do is to try to analyze this cooperation pact. Is we're going to use this extortion payment data and sales from this wholesale distributor from 2012 to 2019. This main distributor is basically the main supplier of both consumer products and pharmaceuticals. Basically, they buy the goods in bulk and resell them to local retailers and pharmacies. For the distribution, the company subcontracts drivers and trucks. They don't have any kind of visible advertisement of the company. This is for security reasons. And how it works is they leave the headquarters, like the warehouses, and then they return the same day. And this can be done because El Salvador is a small country. And we have in our data 1 million of deliveries to these retailers and pharmacies. Importantly is that distribution company has sometimes exclusive contracts, and there are certain goods that are the only ones that they distribute. So they have kind of a power here. In terms how it works for the distribution company is that they have their own security team that monitors the trucks and negotiate with gangs. As I said before, few of these people like trust on the police, or actually they don't believe that the police will do anything. So what they do, most of these firms, actually that I visit, is each of them, they have their private security, which basically they manage these mechanics of extortion payments. So how it works, the truck goes to deliver to a location, and before delivering, the driver is stopped by a gang representative who collects extortion. So what the driver has to do is to call the security team from the distribution company, and they negotiate with the gang member. Then they confirm the amount and receipt of payment. In certain rare cases, this is pre-negotiated for a given period. In our data, we didn't see that much of these cases. And the security team basically emphasized that they do this system because it ensures the safety of drivers. So it's not the driver that has to be negotiated with these gang members. And also they also mentioned that it reduced fraud by drivers. And the driver who would say like, oh, I have to pay this gang X amount, but then it was less. So also for that. And the distributor, and this is because paying extortion, as you well know, is illegal. They have reported all this extortion to the Attorney General office, but it's well known that they haven't done much about this. So this is how it looks. This is El Salvador, the whole country, and we plot all the extortion payments that we have. And the first thing that caught our attention was that there is a lot of variation in these payments. They can go like, sometimes they pay like $50, sometimes they pay cents. Here is just to give you some specifics. They can go to half cents, like to 140. And on average, they pay more or less $14 per route a day, which is about half of the daily labor cost of a truck driver. So what we do is to combine this data with the sales data in order to see first correlations with extortion. I'm not going to show you that now, but the first thing that we saw is that in the correlations of like the payments of extortion, something that correlates a lot with the payment of how much they pay is how much is the local demand of these retailers. So there is some correlation there with the value of goods, but not with the value of goods that are in the truck, which is consistent with this thing that the gangs don't open the trucks. Basically, they ask them where they are going to deliver, and based on that, they calculate whether it is a rich neighborhood or not, how much to charge. Actually, I left it here. Sorry. So maybe this, I'm now doubting that this is not the short slide, sorry, that I download because this was not there. But this is what I was just telling you, that there is this high correlation with the value of goods and delivery. So going to the main thing that I wanted to understand was how this reduction in competition due to a non-aggression pact affect this area. So what we're going to do is a simple diffing diff where we exploit basically the unexpected timing of this 2016 non-aggression pact, and also interacted with some previous measure of gang competition that I'm going to explain in the next slide. And basically everything is like the normal diffing diff. We start with extortion rates, and we basically have all the data at the root municipality month level. because this allows us to basically control for any change that the company may do of changing of routes or not. So we will be able to put municipality route fixed effects as robustness. But overall, everything is like the typical diffing diff. So how we define competition? In general, defining competition outside is difficult, but what we think that with gang competition, what is nice is that when they compete, they produce violence. And in general, homicides is a very good predictor of this gang competition. So what we use is these police reports that have contained detail on homicides, and they determine when a gang is responsible for an homicide when it is possible. So what we are going to define is that, okay, if in this area you have both gangs committing homicides in the area, this is like a measure of competition. So what we do is the HHI using the share of homicides committed by each of the gangs 3 years prior to a non-aggression pact. So for baseline specification, you have to think that competition is equal to 0 if the HHI is in the top quartile and 1 otherwise, okay? And we show in the paper robustness with other measures of competition. So the first thing that we see is that we validate this by basically analyzing, to doing basically the diffing diff as an outcome using the homicides committed by gangs. And we see that the non-aggression pact reduced by 25% the homicides. And you see this much more in areas which were previously competing before the pact. And also we see the similar trends. Also, we look whether this would affect non-gang crime in general, and we don't see that that's the case, which kind of like validates further that what it is reducing is gang competition and not just security levels per se.
Yep,
Next,
2 minutes.
yes. Next, I fully imagine that I was only going to be able to present this. So basically, the next thing we check is, okay, how does this reduction in competition now affect these other activities that gang do, like extortion? And here what we see is that the extortion payments, the rate increases, and this is very consistent even if we think that the distribution company is changing the routes or not delivered to certain locations. You still see this increase in extortion amounts even when we put municipality route fixed effects, and this is pretty high, like 20%. This is the event study, we see no pre-trends, and again there is an increase here. We also look at the extensive margin of extortion, and actually there is no consistent effect. We also look at the aggregate effects. Basically here we aggregate everything at the municipality route level, and the effects are pretty similar as we saw with the intensive margin. There is this increase in the rate that extortion, that the gangs are charging of extortion. So one of our main theories about why extortion is increasing is this thing that I was telling you about related with the gang side, these economies of scope, that if when they are fighting, basically they cannot dedicate enough resources to extortion. And we find some evidence that that's the case. For instance, I think the evidence that I like the most is this fact that if you think that now gangs have more resources, they will have better information about retailers and associated demand for delivered goods. So they may be able to better price discriminate more after the pact. And we actually see that that's the case. After the pact, gangs increase extortion rates much more for deliveries at retailers that have higher value of goods. We also rule out alternative explanations like an increase in demand since now violence is declining. We don't see any effects, but think that this is because we are checking very short brand windows. So we are looking at short run effects. We also don't see any effects of in response in the extensive margin. It's not that they change the number of retailers that they are delivering, the number of routes, and the cost of goods. Okay, I'm going to skip this. And the last thing that I want to show you, I will show you this, which is kind of the effects on the delivery fees. So what I saw you so far is basically a distribution company is facing an increase in extortion, in the extortion rates. So what are they going to do? I told you that basically it's not that they stop distributing to some retailers. They are not reducing the number of products that they deliver because we don't see any effects on the number of unique products or costs. So the next thing we want to see is, okay, are they charging more of a delivery fee to these retailers? And this is what we call with distribution margin. And we see that that's the case. That this pact increase the distribution margin for deliveries that occur nearest to extortion payment. And we also do the IV definitive just to quantify the magnitude. So basically $1 increase in extortion payments, that extortion rate, increase this delivery fee for retailers of about 0.8. I'm going to skip this. And the last thing that I want to show you, this is what I just mentioned you about the extensive margin, that basically the company, the distribution company, is not adjusting in terms of like deliveries or retailers, but just like increasing the cost for these retailers. Then we want to see, okay, how do these retailers respond, no? And basically what we see, and we check only a subset of retailers, which are the pharmacies, because on this one we have data on prices. We see an increase in prices. Basically, these pharmacies, now that they face this increase in extortion, we see that after the pact, there is an increase in prices of certain drugs. And I think that I don't have more time, no, Santiago?
Yes, you're right.
Okay, so basically it's that, and yeah, that's all. Sorry, I managed super bad my time.
Mika,
Yes, Juan.
I don't know. Great paper. Go ahead,
Thank
Juan.
you.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say that. Awesome. So a couple of things. So first of all, and this is sort of minor, but I think that this positive correlation, I mean, this last result is pretty much consistent with the first thing that you showed, which is the positive correlation between the amount of extortions and the price of the goods in the final market. So I was going to say that this is the explanation for that, right? Is that the extortion is actually causing the price to be more expensive in the retail, so that this actual final result that you're showing might explain that the positive correlation that you show in the data,
No.
rather than the extorting firm actually charging more if they think that the truck is going to a richer neighborhood. But more than that, there are two more substantive comments. One is that if you think that these that they are like actually they are reducing the consumer surplus, so they are transferring the increase in the costs to the final consumer via what they charge to retailers and what the retailer charges to in the final product, then the disposable income of people in these places is going down. And if you think of the Beccarian model of crime, this might actually feeding back into the gangs, because people are actually have less money in real terms to
No, yes.
So that is one thing. And the other is like, out of the channels that you mentioned for the increasing of extortion, I didn't see the obvious IO channel, which is that this became a cartel. I mean, gangs were competing, but they became a cartel. So it's not that they have more time to actually do the research and charge better extortions, but actually they are colluding into sharing for information about who to extort and when to extort, and sharing that additional profit of behaving as a cartel. I believe that's the most obvious channel, but you didn't mention that.
Yes, in terms of the first one of the positive correlation, it's a thing that I didn't explain well, that one was based in baseline data, and this is just analyzing the effects of the pact exposed. So this one is like the one that it would be like with causality, but the other one was just a cross-sectional. We were not using the time variation for that correlation that I was showing you in the graph. You're right that eventually demand will affect in the long run effects. So we are now trying to get more data to try to see the effects in the long run, because even though we see it in the short run, like 6 months later, there is no change, in the long run, it should be affected. Yes, we haven't, like, you're right. We were thinking about what you were saying about the information as part also of these days economies of scope, that now they have more resources or time to focus on that, but maybe we should change it. The other one that we were thinking that was the typical IO was that if the firm is deciding, like can when it has competition, can decide the gang that basically charge the least, but this is not the case, because the distribution company told us, no, we just pay whoever it's there. It's not that we can choose much, but it's right. We should try to think more about how to put that with what you were just saying about if they are sharing information or something, which can be true. Like, yes, I can see that happening.
Thank you, Mika. I think Gaurav raised his hand, but I'm going to just suggest you, Gaurav, to maybe write down the comment to Mika so that we switch. which is the last presentation. Thanks, Mika, great paper. Raul, welcome, and again, thank you for accepting being part of this panel.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'm of the other generation. I take some time with this. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so hello everyone, and apologies for half the people in the room who have already seen the paper, but it's changed a lot from the first time some of you saw it. So this is joint work with Gauthier Marché, who's a political anthropologist, Christian, who's a former militia member and played an important role in giving us access to what I'm going to be talking about, and David, who's a economic student at Berkeley, who will be on the market in 2 years. And Al Capone is not a co-author, but the name of the conference. So I just want to put this out there. The paper is fundamentally descriptive. I'm going to show you some regressions, but this is not a paper where we are going to go a long way at trying to defend whether it's identified. It's just a body of evidence that paints a consistent picture. So what's the picture? Let's start with this story. These are the Raya Mutomboki. They are one of the most successful armed groups in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo recently. There are 122 that are currently active, as we know. The Raya Mutomboki emerged initially in 2004 out of a security vacuum, but they were a very small movement and remained dormant until 2011, where they had one of the most spectacular rises of armed groups in the Congolese conflict. So there was a big security vacuum induced by a military policy called regimentation that in one area took away all of the military soldiers of the Congolese army, creating a huge security vacuum, which led to the arrival of the FDLR, who is one of the most brutal armed groups in Eastern DRC. And so in response to this insecurity, there was this spectacular rise of the Raya Mutomboki. They took control about most of the district. Shabunda, they became so successful that they expanded across Eastern DRC. What's important is that they gained wide popular support and they drove the FDLR out of Shabunda. And so the existing qualitative work on them compares them to not just the social organization, but in fact the social movement. And the social movement aspect may not be characteristic of all armed groups in Eastern DRC, but I want to focus on the fact that rather than being a violent firm that produces violence for economic rents, they are better described as a social organization. And what do I mean by this? So this example crystallizes two important aspects that we want to talk about in this paper. The first is, you can see it in this quote, the FDLR acted as mercenaries, pillaging and carrying out massacres. They became more and more harmful until the population organized themselves, given that the national army was incapable, or other people in the area also mentioned each village chief went to their village to sensitize the youth to liberation and peace. The young men who identify with that joined the movement voluntarily. So these are the two points that we want to talk about in this paper. The first is, and both are kind of a deviation from the standard prevailing framework for armed conflict in economics. It doesn't rule it out, but it complements it. And it introduces the notion of society in armed conflict. The first is that the motivations that lead people to join in the Raya Mutomboki, for instance, are not necessarily reduced to economic incentives for appropriation, which is the standard way in which we typically think, with a trade-off coming from the Becker traditional model of crime. But there is a lot of non-pecuniary motivations that have to do with justice, revenge, and protection of the community. The second assumption that we kind of complement here is that the decision to join is not even an individual decision. In many cases, it's a community process where the community institutions get activated, not just to mobilize, coordinate motivations, but actually use coercion and coerce people who perhaps were not motivated to join militias. So we're going to separately analyze these two ways in which the economic, self-interested material motivations are linked to society. So what we do in this paper is we kind of analyze the labor market in the last 20 years of one of the longest conflicts in recent history, the one in the DRC. There's 122 armed groups. And what's important about this conflict is that according to historians who are experts of the conflict, a very important division in this group are groups that are either foreign armies or foreign orchestrated groups who set bases in Eastern DRC, and all the Congolese militias. The militias vary in the extent to which they are local or not, but this is an important distinction. And you will see where the militia aspect comes from. It doesn't come from how you classify. So we look at a wide-ranging set of questions, and here three. The first is, who are the militias? These are going to be the focus of the study, because foreign-led armed groups in terms of non-pecuniary motivations is more complicated. So who are the militias? What do they do? And how important are they for the conflict? And once we establish those facts, we are interested in one question: who are the people who join the militias? Why do they join? And how do their motivations relate to the objectives of militias? And can recruitment be explained as choices made by individuals or instead by communities? So these are difficult questions, and everything I'm going to show you is suggestive rather than conclusive. The key input into our analysis is a data set, some of which I've already used in other papers, but not all of it. In fact, a component of it was designed for this study back in 2013. So the data set is a panel on armed groups, villages, and households, or retrospective panel, that's important, dating back to 1990 in 239 villages in North and South Kivu in Eastern DRC, using quote-unquote investigative techniques, which I won't talk about today, but a big part of the study is to verify, is to design those techniques, given basically focusing on the footprints that armed groups left in all of those communities in the last 20 years. And the output is basically some village level data set that has the history of armed groups chapters in each of the village. All the armed groups, they govern territory by creating chapters in different villages. The chapters may be created by the village or by the armed groups. So there's 707 episodes of a village chapter and 6,800 histories of individuals obtained through interviews in about 2,000 households. So we sometimes have information on their family members, from which we obtain 662 individual histories of combatants. Of course, one important aspect, especially in other settings, is, are people really going to tell us that they are or were combatants? So we only designed this study once we were sure about this, and this is just the outcome of a triangulation exercise. So to verify that the information we obtained from the household survey was more or less accurate, there can be survivor bias, there can be reporting bias. We also collected at the village level during 1 week of effort, basically the total number of people who joined armed groups in the last 20 years. And so these are the estimates for this period for the average village. According to the village reports, this is the province where this data exists. So it's South Kivu. About 55 people, one village produces 55 people who join a militia, according to the aggregate numbers, but we obtain very much the same number if we just look at the household report when they tell us whether they joined a militia. When we exclude the households who did not always live in this village, we get also a relatively close number. So that's relatively encouraging. We don't have such good results for foreign armed group, and that's encouraging because we know from the qualitative work that underpins this study that participation in foreign armed groups is more taboo for people to tell us. And there may be another aspect is that participating in foreign armed groups is not necessarily a local phenomenon, while participating in militia is either in your village or you return to your village. It's not like you participated in a criminal gang and you'll be kind of perhaps ostracized. The militias are part of what people support. And so that's the participants in a militia in North and South Kivu in the data. So villages where at least one person participated. And these are the villages where at least foreign armed group perpetrated at least one attack in the sample of 8 households. So who are the militias? What do they do, and how important are they? So these are the militias. This is just a classification of the armed groups in the data. It's completely uncontroversial except for one of them called local defense. And as you will see, the results are completely independent on how we classify those. Every historian knows that the M23 is a foreign-led armed group, and the others, the Mai Mais, are popular militia. So based on this, I'm just going to show you some descriptives. The first is militias are important. When you look at both North and South Kivu, the estimated total number of recruits in a village is 32 compared to 2.1 for foreign-led armed groups, or less for the Congolese army. What this means is that of the rural labor market, violent labor market, militias are 94% of labor. Of course, foreign armed groups may also recruit in other areas, but the predominant way in which we think of armed conflict often has in one place recruitment and violent events. And so here, what this shows you for rural areas is that militias are the predominant recruiter. They're also successful. In terms of violent events, they represent 36% of total violent events. They represent approximately 50% of the number of village chapter episodes in the whole sample. So they are relevant in terms of governance. They tax also like other foreign armed groups because they need to finance their operations. And two important aspects are militia begin to make them different. The first is that they have much more popular support than any other armed group. And this difference is driven by militia who are militia chapters who are formed in the village. In fact, that's where we don't need the classification. All of the results I'm going to show you are driven by whether a chapter was formed in the village, which represents approximately half of the chapters of militia. The other half are militias who are extending. And the second aspect is that militias security that they provide appears to be much more effective than any other, and that's driven by the militias formed in the village. So they are violent, they govern, they recruit most of the people, and they provide more valuable security. So what are militias maximizing? One of the central objectives, although what they actually do in practice varies, of course, but here is the mission statement of one of the militias, the Nduma Defense of Congo, contribute to pacification of local communities. And then there's a lot of kind of social responsibility jargon, but all of the militias mission statements that we had access to, whether they are sincere or not, are focused on the protection of the communities against the foreign invasion by Rwanda-led armed groups. And so independently of whether this is sincere or not, is going to play an important role in recruitment. And so recruitment happens, this is the stock and the inflows of recruits into militias. You can see these are the years in which there is an increase in militia recruitment. This is the rise of the Raya Mutomboki that is the most successful militia in the sample. And indeed, consistent with, and this is not a regression, but consistent with militia recruitment being motivated by protection, these spikes in mobilization coincide with spikes in violence and insecurity. So if you look at whether there is an established protection force, most often it's the state, or whether there are attacks on the villages by foreign-led armed groups, and you can combine the two in some insecurity rate. It's exactly in the spikes of insecurity. This is the start of the first Congo War, the start of the second Congo War, the Coltan shock that led to activation of foreign-led violence. This is a security vacuum created by a peace agreement, and this is the regimentation policy I mentioned. This is not a proof, but it suggests that militia recruitment appears to respond to moments of insecurity. Okay. So do they really provide security? So far, everything I've shown you is whether they are perceived to provide security or not. So this is just an OLS regression. There's no identification. If you look at whether the respondent of the household survey reports to have been attacked in a given year, so it's a panel, the presence of a militia chapter doesn't have a significant effect on reducing violence. It's negative. But if the person participates in a militia chapter, the person is more protected. So it seems to be related to protection of the family and private protection. However, when you look at events that are more gruesome, both the presence of a militia chapter and participating in a militia chapter are negatively predictors of whether the respondent's household experiences sexual violence, consistent with the idea that militias indeed, mission indeed coincides with what they do, which is to provide security in addition to other things. So having painted a little picture of who the militias are, let me tell you who the militia warriors are and what motivates them. So in the sample, in the most narrow sample, this is verified when we increase to all samples that we have, but we have this small sample that has all of the variables for the analysis. In this sample, most of the people report, these are self-report, to be driven by non-pecuniary motivations, which are mostly protection of the community, of the family, or of revenge. Economic incentives play a small role. And there's also people who report to have been coerced, and that's not abduction. All of them report social forms of coercion by the community. So the problem is that people, of course, we know, may have motivated reasoning for why they joined, or they may tell us wrong reasons. They have incentives to make their causes more noble. So maybe economic incentives is the driving force. So one way to check for this is we write a very simple, yes, 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so basically we write a very simple ROI model that has some predictions that allows us to look at the types of people who join the militia, and from there look at whether sorting into militia is consistent with non-economic motivations. And the only predictor that we find for joining militia is whether their family has previously been attacked, and they are the richer people, which is the opposite of what would be predicted by the Roy model if the motives for joining are economic. So after a few verifications, what we rule out in the patterns in the data allows us to say that basically it's the richer people who are more victim of attacks. And so that could explain why they are the people who are more likely to enter militias. So to verify this, we run the classical event study with the state-of-the-art techniques and so on, controlling for individual, village, year, and age fixed effects to look at whether exposure to victimization in the household indeed causes participation in the future into militia. And the effect is there. This spike here comes from the fact that a big share of the effect is driven by the Raya Mutomboki, and they start in 2011 while there's very few attacks in the sample in between the Congo Wars and Raya Mutomboki. The problem here that we look at is that if your household is attacked, it's possible that the village has been attacked also. And so what is motivating you, the attack on the village or the attack on the household? So we decompose these into two channels, the effect of collective victimization. So we look at whether the village is attacked, controlling for whether the household is attacked, and we find that there is an effect, and that the effect is driven, the effect of this village attack, by revenge and by protection of the community in terms of magnitude. But when you look at whether the household is attacked, controlling for whether the village is attacked, so this is within village year, including village year fixed effects, you also find that the household being attacked is a strong predictor in the past, is a strong predictor of whether they join. And that's driven by people who join and say that they join to protect their family. So consistent with the interpretation that this OLS is informative. So we then kind of price these motivations and show that it would take 8 times an increase in the national per capita income outside of militia to deter this effect, to take people outside from the group. But the last point I wanted to make in the remaining -1 minute is the second point of the paper, which is the fact that some people do not join for voluntary reasons. They join as a result of village processes. And the most important fact is village chiefs who organize recruitment campaigns voluntarily to mobilize the youth or sometimes to coerce. When you look at the relationship between chief-initiated campaigns and motivation, it's just an OLS. Yes, it appears to be there. It appears to be the case that when there is a campaign, more people join, motivated by protection of the community, but also coercion. And that's where the action is going to come from for chief campaign. So what we do, and that's the last part, we take advantage of this quasi-experimental variation in the security vacuums created only in one district, this one in Shabunda, and we look at whether these correlate with the creation of chief initiation campaigns, and whether these lead also to more participation. So you see in these two vacuums in this province, there's a spike in chief-initiated campaigns, especially in the second part, but not in the other provinces. So, and you also have this spike in recruitment that coincides exactly with these two security vacuums, but not in the other provinces. So when we just regress on these security vacuums, whether people join and whether there are campaigns, indeed, campaigns respond to this security vacuum, and the security vacuum just leads everyone to join for whatever reason. And the second thing we do is we decompose. We cannot instrument because the security vacuum might cause participation and campaigns at the same time, but at least to document the channels through which participation is induced by the security vacuum, we simply decompose the security vacuum by whether there is a campaign or not. And even though this is purely based on, is not identified, what you see, one of the most important aspects here, because coercion never appears as significant, comes only in response when there is a chief-initiated campaigns. So that's not identified, but it's consistent with the idea that chief-initiated campaigns or the mobilization by the community responds to a collective action problem of insecurity. And that's the weak part, that the mechanism through which they work is, among others, coercion. There's also other mechanisms, but it's even more difficult to claim that these would not have existed in the absence of the campaign. So that's it. That's the main point, is the notion that violent conflict is sometimes produced by society. That's true in many conflicts across the world. You can think about the narco in Mexico as being motivated by greed, but there's all the autodefensas, like in many conflicts, whose motivations are more complex and more connected with society. So we don't rule out the basic economic framework, but we hope that it complements by introducing this. Yeah, I don't know how far I am.
No, we're good. We're good. I think we're already like stealing some minutes from the break, but great paper, Raul, and thank you very much for presenting it. I have like one quick question, and then maybe we can get some others from the audience. Like, if you think about non-pecuniary motives for being recruited, I don't know what's the context in the DRC in terms, for instance, on like ethnic identity, and whether like there's some like religious values about like social preferences that you could exploit, like for instance, to see whether in some communities which have like religious values or whatever, which make them closer to their communities, would be more prone to participate in some specific type of gang or something like that. Yeah, so I was just wondering whether you have data on that and whether it makes sense.
This is really interesting because, and I think it does make sense, just qualitatively. I can tell you that the most successful mobilizations in the recent war have something to do with two things. First, the extent of organization of society in terms of associations of the youth that pre-exist the conflict and that pre-exist the colonial era. And second, when you talk to all these different groups, those that were more successful, this may be purely endogenous, but they all remembered the mobilizations in 1906, for instance, of the Cherubare by the Nyanga, who fought the colonizers, or in the 60s, who fought the communist guerrillas that were supported by China and were perceived as foreign invaders. So it seems to be, at least there's an aspect of persistence that is either that the seeds were created for successful mobilization, or as I think some communities like the Lega are much more closely tied to the community. But yeah, I think we have the data to at least document that this is the case.
Interesting.
Yeah, one. I have a question, and there are 2 minutes before the change of session, so there's time for my question and probably some more. So, so my question has to do with the. I mean, I kept thinking something related to your last slide, which is okay. So this is the obvious sort of dynamics for the creation and the expansion of self-defense organizations, which have, of course, motivations related to previous victimization and non-pecuniary motivations, right? But then down the road, of course, these militias also are very violent, and they get into the sort of dynamics of territorial contestation and civilian victimization, and also need to engage in economic activities, not because they're motivated by greed, but they need to maintain their group and their campaign, and therefore they're going to, in equilibrium in the states that behave as yet another armed group, which probably is going to create some other grievances to the future generation or to other people in some other municipalities that had not been affected in the past. So I guess my question is more like a philosophical question of okay, we understand that, and this makes sense that for these kind of groups there are motivations other than economic, and of course we're not in the greed and grievance debate anymore, and we don't believe what Paul Collier and Anke Halber said 20 years ago any longer, but this is definitely worrisome in terms of the dynamics of a war such as Congo's and the perspectives of achieving peace at some point in the future, right?
Yes, I think two things. The first that you see a lot in the Congolese conflict, for instance, is the kind of universal correlation between how impersonal interaction is, or how closely tied community is, and cooperation. And so these militias that form in the community are very cooperative. As they expand, the kind of social ties that they have with the communities they govern weaken and weaken, and they become more predatory, looking exactly like foreign-led armed groups. And so kind of the community or moral motivations that led the militia to form are also the foundations for violence. And I think it's not inconsistent. It's like when you look at the literature of like moral motivations in psychology, these are the people who have the highest capacity for violence as well. So people those who study like who join like terrorist groups or like violent organizations, a lot of them are people who are more morally motivated than the rest. I don't know if that answers the question, but kind of to bring the two together, basically the community processes that and these kind of pro-social motivations are compatible with like the most antisocial form of behavior because of parochiality. Does that, I don't know, I just randomly thought.
No, yeah, I mean, it wasn't really a question, but I think your what you said complements well what I was thinking. So yeah.
Thank you, Juan. I think we have 3 minutes until the next session, right, Juan?
3 minutes until the next session, yes.
So maybe we can get another question from the audience, if anyone has one.
I have a clarification question for Mika, otherwise.
Good, go ahead.
And I'm sorry I missed the beginning, so you may already have answered.
That's why I'm laughing, Raul. You weren't there, and it was like, how is that coming? Okay, no, ask.
So what was the question? No, I missed the first line. My question is, at the end, we see this two increases in the rate of extortion and increases in prices. And it's shown that the increases in prices are caused or channeled by the increase in extortion. Is it possible that the two are created by the pact, or instead even that the pact raises the prices or some other economic mechanism, and extortion rates are just adjusting to the value of the merchandises? I don't know, even though it's a rate.
No, yes, and actually that's the part that that I couldn't present. So what you're saying is that there could be a demand channel because, of course, the pact now people are more safe. At the same time, they are not fighting the territory. So we try to look at least at the short run, like the expenditures of people, like income or some other measures of development or something like that of demand. We don't see that moving, at least in the short run. This is what I was just telling Juan, and we're trying to get data to try to see more in the long run because we see only up to 1 year and a half after the pact. So, and I think that would make to try to analyze, but at least in the short run, we think that those increases in prices are due to this increase in the delivery fee that they are facing, these pharmaceutical and retailers. Yeah. But of course, this is like, that's why we don't do the IV definitive because still this is very reduced form. So we are seeing the effects of the pact. We are trying to say that it's due to this extortion, but we are working on that.
So if it was a demand channel, you would see people richer, for instance.
Yes.
Good. I have 1 minute for another question for Mika. Like, is it possible that these places that are under more competition, it's because they are more valuable, for instance, for the extortion market? Like they're competing because there are more rents to be extracted there?
Yes, and actually this is something that I didn't show. When you see like just the cross-section, the correlation, you see that there is that interesting positive correlation, which is like places where you see more homicides are also correlated with places that are richer. And it's because of this, as what you're saying, is that there are also places where you have more to extort. And I think, sorry, Miguel, I think you have a question that in the middle of Raul presentation and I haven't responded. Do you want to ask it here? Sorry, I put you on the spot. But since we have...
Don't worry, but you already asked my question. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
No worries.
Good. So thanks, everyone. I think...
No, thank you. And thank Juan for organizing the session.
Thank you, Carolina, Garaf, Raul, Mika, and Juan for letting me.
Thank you, Santiago. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Mika, do you have 5 minutes? Oh, se fue.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Juan.